Hello and welcome. It gives me such great pleasure to talk about the future of work and why we need to rethink a lot of our assumptions and do things differently. I'm joined with an extraordinary group of people, a wonderful panel. The first person on it is Jared Spataro, who's a corporate vice president at Microsoft 365. Shamsi Iqbal is a principal researcher at the Productivity and Intelligence Group at Microsoft Research. And Gloria Mark is a professor at the University of California, Irvine. Hello, Jared, Shamsi, and Gloria. Great to have you here.
Great to be here.
Fantastic. So, guys, to start us off, I'm going to ask a single straightforward question, and I want sort of like a one-word answer. You're not allowed to say more. Is remote working a positive or a negative? Shamsi, why don't you start?
I can't say it depends.
I think it would be better for you to say you can't flip a coin and land it on the edge. So heads or tails, positive or negative?
Yes, positive.
Okay. Gloria?
Negative.
Jared?
100% positive.
Wow, this is incredible. Two people from Microsoft totally don't understand how the world works. And Gloria Mark is the only one who's willing to speak truth. My goodness, what are we going to do about this? Gloria, you're clearly the outlier here, because I think it's totally positive as well. So tell me, how do you come to this completely false and inaccurate, conclusion?
So, you just can't replace face-to-face interaction when you're working remotely. And there's a number of reasons why face-to-face is better. You can have spontaneous, informal interaction. You see the full range of people's facial expressions. You know when you can go in and interrupt people. You can see if their doors open, doors are closed. There's all kinds of signals you get in a physical environment. And when you're working at home, you just lose all that information. You lose the social information, you lose the signaling. So it's a completely different experience.
Different experience, and you think negative. But there's a case to be made that actually we can improve the workplace, particularly for knowledge work, by doing it in a virtual setting. So both of you from Microsoft have said that it is a positive. And Jared, you were more gung-ho and said 100% positive. I'm actually not as gung-ho as with you. I put it at like 99 or 99.9. But why do you think 100%?
Well, I just don't think you can judge a car by a Model T, But we are going to grow into this idea of remote work. We are working with tools that are rudimentary. They're going to get better. And our observation, our research seems to indicate that working remotely is also a skill. People have to learn it. Organizations have to learn it. So I think if you take a snapshot in time and say, have the last 10 months been positive? Boy, I totally agree with Gloria. There's ups and downs. But will this be positive, over time? I think 100%.
Okay. Shamsi, you wanted to throw the coin and land on the edge. So clearly you see the pros and the cons. Let me turn to you as our wise King Solomon on the call, in this virtual setting, and tell us what are the pros and cons, and you came down on the positive. Tell me why you did that.
So I'll start off with this proclamation that around 7 a.m. in the morning, it's great. Around 9 a.m. when my kids wake up and they're getting ready for school, and then it becomes challenging. So that's why I was going to say it depends. But really thinking about, just following up on what Gloria said, the flexibility is huge. The fact that I can start my work from my desk without having to worry about going out, preparing for the day outside of the house, I think that's huge. Gloria and I work together a lot, and she's in California. I am in Washington. So we have been working remotely, and that has worked out. Obviously, being in person is great. And for all the reasons that Gloria said, it's important to be in person because you want to be able to share that same, you want to be in the same location. You want to share the facial expressions, the camaraderie, which can't quite do well yet in the remote setting. But as Jared said, we are building these tools, we are developing these new technologies, and it's only going to get better.
Okay, now you folks have actually done a lot of research. You bring data to these questions. And so I'd be curious to know, what are some of the trends that you're finding in terms of how people in this pathetic and terrible natural experiment we've all had to endure for the past 12 months, how people are changing their work practices when they do it remotely?
Well,
Well,
I can jump in
I
with.
can.
Oh, please,
Sorry,
Gloria, go ahead.
you're all the beginning. I should have called on one and another. I heard Jared first. So, Jared, why don't you go first? Then we'll bring it to others.
All right, make sure you hit Gloria because she's got some great data too. One of the things that's been interesting to us is what has happened as people have jumped remote and how they've adjusted. And so a couple of data points that struck me as interesting. When we look at how people are working, we find that they're in 55% more meetings per week than they were pre-pandemic. That's pretty significant. We also find that the span of the workday, the time between when they start and when they finish, has increased in most countries by over an hour, and in some countries by over 2 hours. We've seen that within one of our products called Teams, which is kind of a platform for people to communicate and collaborate, that after hours chats, so those are the chats after 5 p.m., have increased almost 70%. And weekend use of that product, Teams, has increased 200%. So you might think that I would think all that's bad, but I think what's happened here is that we're starting to get a beat and understand that people don't operate like robots. And so I think that this remote work thing has shined a light on kind of how people are really productive, and it's causing us to really have a good conversation about that. So that's kind of how I'm interpreting some of this data.
Okay, I'm going to go back to some of it, but Gloria, I want you to sort of weigh in with the data that you have.
Yeah, so we've been doing a study of remote teamwork. And one of the things we found is that people have natural rhythms, right? They have chronotypes. Some people are late morning type, late evening type. Some people are early morning types. And what we're finding with work at home is that people have slippage into their natural chronotypes. So, you might start in a physical workspace, you might show up at work at, say, 9 a.m. But if you're a late type person, you begin your work, you start out at 9, and then after a few weeks, you kind of slip into 10 a.m. and then 11 a.m. And what we're finding is that teams are misaligned. So you've got early morning types working with late types, and this can create a lot of conflict. And it also creates additional pressure for coordination among the teams because they need to find times when they can align for meetings, for sharing results, and so on. So it becomes difficult for them.
Okay, so that's an interesting friction to have. But in the past, the way we've handled that friction is somebody just had to suffer through it, right? Because a night owl would have to get up in the morning. Okay, so you would think that in a virtual setting, we could actually turn this into a positive. Suddenly, in the asynchronous form of modern work, that can happen on an online setting. You don't have to be in the same meeting at the same time in some instances. The night owls will do more of the work at night and do better work. And the early birds will do their work in the morning and do better work. And the whole company and the whole team will prosper. So how can we overcome the friction and actually, or maybe not overcome it, how can we harness the friction and turn it into a positive by boosting team performance in a remote setting rather than seeing it depreciate? I'll go to Shamsi. You haven't said anything for a while, so maybe you have an answer on
Yeah,
this.
I was going to chime in. We have worked across time zones for quite a bit. So this is not something that's entirely new in that sense. And what now we are seeing is that even within the same time zone, that people, because of the same reasons Gloria described, that there are different types of people, but also people now have different types of responsibilities. So I might be homeschooling my kids during the day. That means that I might have to make up for the time at the end of the day or late into the night. And so one of the things that we're trying to learn better now, which we probably didn't do as well before, is that how can we separate out the synchronous part of work where people need to be together and they need to collaborate simultaneously, and the asynchronous part where I can take my part of my team activity and I can do it independent of everyone else. And so I think that we're trying to learn more about people's work patterns and how teams work and how we can separate out and distribute, so that at the end people get to choose the time that works best for them. But again, they also have some common time together where they can all come together and do the things that they need to do while being all in the same virtual space and time.
And Kenneth, I look at this for a moment and I just think, yeah, what we're seeing here that I think is so positive is a really detailed conversation about work. You know what I mean? Like up to this point, what we ended up having was a whole bunch of pretty rigid rules about how work works, how it's supposed to progress, based on it seems like 1947 or something, 1950. Like I don't know why it worked that way, and we had a really hard time challenging how it's working. So I think part of the reason I take that kind of provocative stance is we're having a discussion about what human performance is at work. What's it take? What's flexibility? What can we do at the same time? What can we kind of pull apart? And I think starting to shine a light on that is super healthy. And I think going forward, a lot of organizations, whether it be corporations, schools, governments, they're all going to start to have to discuss this idea of like, what are we trying to accomplish? And how do we do this given these new constraints and new flexibility? That's totally healthy from my perspective.
I'm so glad you brought it up. And the thing that I want to emphasize, which I completely subscribe to, is most of what we think about work and the decisions we make around it and the culture that has been formed around it has simply evolved, and it's evolved completely uncritically. And during the pandemic, some of the shibboleths around it were completely exposed as nonsensical. So the idea that someone needed to check in, work 9 to 5, and they were only productive in the office, which pretty much typifies law firms and accountancies, particularly in Europe. Maybe in America, they're a little bit more flexible, but even not that much. The presumption is unless I see you at your desk, you're not working, which of course for white collar work is absolutely truly idiotic, because in fact, most people do far better work, either they're in their home office or like Winston Churchill with their laptop propped up in their bed. He wrote in bed on a piece of paper and pen, but not with a laptop. Okay. So I'm wondering about other areas in which we can apply data and empirical evidence to expose these misnomers about work and improve work. You've given me some great sort of stats about, meetings. How about how people are working in other domains and their productivity and what makes them productive?
Yeah, I think Shamsi has some pretty interesting research that really caught my attention when it came to kind of performance and ramping up, ramping down, that type of thing.
Yeah, I can start off with a little bit of kind of like insight into the type of research that we have been doing. And so, and Gloria has been a part of that as well. And so we have been mostly looking at information workers. I think that one thing that became really relevant in the pandemic was some research that we did back in 2017. And so that was pre-pandemic. We were thinking about, well, how can we put this separation between people's work life and their personal life as they move from home to work and work back to home. And this was partly based on some of our own personal experiences, is that, well, when we come to work, we're still processing home related things at the back of our minds. And when we go back home at the end of the day, we're still thinking about work. And how can we disengage from work at the end of the day so that we can be actually present at home without thinking about work all the time, and vice versa. And so we thought that, well, I mean, we can't be the first people who are facing this problem. And so there has to be research in other domains. And so we went into organizational the behavior and occupational health psychology literature. And we did find that, well, adequately disengaging at the end of the day is really important for productivity and sustained productivity. So what we did is that, and that was the time when all these digital assistants were coming into being or fruition. And so we decided that, okay, we're going to develop this digital assistant that's going to just interact with people at the beginning of the day and interact with people at the end of the day and ask them a couple of questions to help them just disengage. And so we leveraged cognitive behavior therapy to come up with the questions. And we talked to some of the cognitive behavior therapists to say that, well, what helps people disengage? And we found that it's actually super simple. You just ask them about how their day was and what they want to do and how they felt about the day and what they want to do the next day. And so you can see that this is allowing people reflection so that they can just reflect, my day was good, bad, I did this, that. And then you are getting them to plan very briefly for the next day. What do you want to do tomorrow? How do you want to feel tomorrow? And that's it. We found that people also wanted to continue talking with the digital assistant, fully knowing it was not a person, there was no one behind it, but they would share more about their day. And this was kind of like, it was positioned that this would happen at the end of the day when people would be commuting. So they're putting not only this physical space between the two locations, but they're also putting this mental space. And then when they came back the next day, they would do the same thing. What we found was interesting is that about, go ahead.
No, keep on going. This is great. What did you find?
6 in 10 people found that it was they were more productive, and about 12 to 15% increase in productivity. So I wanted to just stop there.
This is so amazing. I love this because the mind simply takes the data points and immediately leaps, at least for myself, like with an entrepreneurial mindset and a media mindset, at the products that you could make for it. I would immediately say, oh, if we need to give people downtime, oh, sure, we can give them a virtual assistant to query them about their day. We could also have the company buy them a subscription to a magazine, for example, and read news and sort of give them that transition. So without trumpeting one particular wise idea of how you could turn it into an entrepreneurial product or service, tell me about how else you could actually take your research and turn it into, in the case for Microsoft, a product or a service. Like, how do you implement that to say, okay, we've got the research finding, here's what we're going to do as an intervention, we're going to get this benefit from it. Jared, I'm going to pick on you. And the reason why is that I know that you actually have a slew of products in which you're actually thinking long and hard about how to do these sorts of things.
Yeah, that's right. I would kind of make the analogy that, sometime along the history of sports, we discovered that working out hard every day wasn't the way to actually get to better performance. We realized that humans do really well, as Shamsi was talking about, and Gloria has research as well, with this idea of kind of like really hard efforts and then some time to recover. And that kind of cyclical nature is really important. So when we think broadly, without referring to any particular product, when we think broadly about where this could all go, we think there's this opportunity to focus on corporate performance, on business performance, on individual performance, by thinking about it as more of a cycle, if you will, about really sustained effort for a while that's consistent, but then the ability to take a step back and reflect. And although that sounds a little bit new agey, at least to me, the first time I heard it, what we see is that there's a lot of science that backs it up, that there is this idea that if you want people to be innovative, creative, to establish and strengthen the bonds between people, you have to push and then relax and push and relax. And so there's so much, whether it would be that wonderful subscription to a newspaper that made them thoughtful, or, something else, some sort of other service that just engaged them in a different type of way. So that's why I say we have to learn how to be productive in this new moment, in this new media, in this new environment. And that's pretty exciting to me.
I think it's super interesting. I mean, one of the things that I noticed to that is I took up a meditation app, like so many people do. And what I found, though, was when I was meditating in the morning, when I was clearing my mind, what was I thinking about in the vacuity and peaceful of my mindfulness? But my calendar and all the things that I should be doing. And although you would think that this intervention of the cold hand of the man and having to be an employee in the modern economy would be a problem, I found it was just the opposite. To be able to take time to actually think through the work that you're going to be doing was actually quite relaxing and actually made me a better employee. So actually, I was all in on it. And I thought it was actually lovely. So let me ask the panel, but particularly Gloria, how would we, am I denying something about myself in terms of work-life balance and doing some sort of violence and mental harm by never switching off? Or actually, is that a viable way to go forward as an employee, to actually use these sort of mindfulness techniques as a way to improve who I am as a person, but also as a journalist, as a professional?
Oh, I think it's a wonderful tool to use. And one of the challenges that that we found from our data looking at people working remotely is that it's very hard to separate work and personal life. The boundaries have become so porous with this work from home context. So even though people might have a dedicated workspace, they're still in their home, and there's still the possibility to be pulled away by the chores you have to do at home or your laundry or all kinds of things. So you haven't really made that complete separation. So it's really important to be able to find a way to make a separation. Now, the easiest way to make a separation is a physical separation. So you actually travel to a different location. You have a different context, different set of people. And then you come back to home where you've got your home context. So that's an easy way to make that separation. Although, as you pointed out, sometimes it's not so easy because we have carryover effects of what we do at work, and we bring those home. And I'm thinking in particular about stress and emotional conflicts and those kinds of things we experience at work. Very often we'll bring those into our home life, right? So we have to be thinking about creating that very clear separation. And I do think things like mindfulness, meditation, these are wonderful tools.
Now, I don't want to seem too utopian, but I can't help but think that in a virtual world and working remotely, we can actually overcome some of these problems because, of course, it's not like the physical workplace was non-stressful. In fact, in some ways, it could be more stressful. And maybe I'm an outlier, but I actually feel that when I'm in a digital setting, it liberates me in some ways. It allows me to take risks that I might not take when I'm actually in a physical setting. In a meeting, for example, I might be more talkative when I'm on, in a camera rather than in a meeting. Tell me about how Microsoft is seizing up these opportunities, sizing up these opportunities and seizing the opportunities.
Yeah, if I go back to that idea of kind of the Model T, I think when we started the pandemic, the tools hadn't really contemplated how dramatic the shift would be. And so we have just tried to take a step back, be students of the moment. So a couple of very specific examples. We've actually introduced a feature within that product called Teams that we call virtual commute, of all things. Everybody thought they loved the idea. They didn't want to commute. We've just talked about why this idea of ramping up and ramping down is actually really valuable. We've just called it a virtual commute. It really catches people's attention. Another one is we partnered with Headspace to provide literally some meditation guidance for you, which we think is important. And a final one that is really fascinating to me is there has been this talk of the idea of like, man, but one of the downsides is we stare into our screens all day. Isn't that fatiguing? Don't we feel something different? Turns out the science bears that out. It is a little harder. We did some research to figure out why that was with brain scans. And what we found was there was something about our different backgrounds that make it difficult to parse out, as an example, what's going on with each person. And so we use some AI technology and a new feature called Together Mode that cuts you out of your background, sticks you just simply into a shared background. It can be a coffee shop. It can be, a stadium. We used it with the NBA as an example for the National Basketball Association in the United States for their fans. And it actually does literally lower the stress levels on your brain, which is really interesting, and create a deeper connection between people. So again, kind of going back to that kind of Model T idea, I think there are so many really great opportunities for innovation here that are going to make remote work much more tenable for us over the long term.
That's so interesting. It was actually a Headspace app that I was using in terms of my meditation upon work. I guess I would then wonder what we're learning now to the metaphor of the Model T is interesting because it's happening at a time when everyone's basically stressed out of their minds because there's a deadly pandemic going on. But in the future, we're going to be in a hybrid office, right? Or a hybrid workspace in which we'll be at home while in the office. And we won't have that overwhelming pressure of being sort of locked in, with our families for, a year. We'll actually be living and breathing, and the stress level will go down, we'll be more relaxed. When that takes place, how are you conceiving of products to meet this new world, these new trends that's not COVID, not wrapped up in COVID, but just simply wrapped up in what's best for a given organization at a given time?
Yeah. Maybe I'll tee it up, but I'd love to hear what Shamsi has to say. The interesting thing to me, I'd say, Kenneth, is think about this. Once we get past kind of what I call post-pandemic, if even 10 or 20% of your workforce decided to be remote on a given day, man, that changes the dynamic entirely. And I anticipate it won't be the same people every day. Monday and Tuesday will be different from Wednesday. That just totally creates, again, like we talked about, this need to take a step back and say, do we have the right technology? Have we learned how to do this as an organization? Have we brought in some of what Gloria was saying of like, have we looked at the pros and the cons, the puts and the takes, and figured out what we're going to do as going to work? But I'd love to hear what Shamsi and Gloria have to say.
Yeah, let me turn it in that order to Shamsi and Gloria.
Yeah, so I think that again, in past years or when we think about productivity, we've always thought about getting work done and how can we kind of like produce more. And the past 11 months has taught us that that's not the only important thing. If we're thinking about longer term resilience, where we can kind of like build our strengths, help us kind of like be mindful and thoughtful about the things that we do, and eventually be able to sustain productivity longer, we really need to think about well being. And one of the things that we are doing in Microsoft Research is thinking about this problem of how can we balance productivity with well being. And one thing that we have been looking at is that we are kind of like the calendar is one way that we at least schedule our day. And what if we actually start scheduling time for taking care of our well-being? We can schedule time to focus, which is also super important now that we have difficulties in finding time to focus. But what about we schedule time for, say, virtual commuting in the morning, time for well-being, and this becomes then something that everyone does, and it gives you that comfort. You have this shared knowledge across the company that everyone does it. Now is my well-being time. It makes well-being a first party, or it's a first priority alongside productivity, and I think that this helps the whole organization, the whole community. Gloria?
Gloria.
So I'm all for well-being. I'm 100% for well-being. So it's important to consider that we can't expect people to have extremely high focus the entire day. In the same way, you can't expect a person to bicycle uphill for long stretches of time. You know, you need to coast, you need to go downhill for a bit. And so actually in research that Shamsi and I have done, we found that people have different kinds of attention in the workplace. And focus is just one kind of attention. So people also can do things like rote mechanical types of work. They can be bored, they can be frustrated. And it's important to consider a kind of balance among these different kinds of attention. We can't push people to be focused the entire day. In fact, one of the most interesting things we found in our research is that people are happiest when they do this kind of rote mechanical kind of work. Why? Because it's easy, it can be gratifying, you get things done. And so we have to think about designing work for times when people are at their peak for focus, when it's best for them to be focused. And actually, we did find people have peak focus for the most part late morning and mid-afternoon. And other times they use other kinds of attention. So here's an opportunity for technology to be able to help people design work so that they can understand what their peak focus times are. And they can do their hardest work at those peak focus times. And other times they can do other things like do meetings or do this kind of diddly squat work that needs to be done to just get it out of the way. So we need to think of a balance.
This is so interesting, but also inspiring, because what I love about it is that you can actually watch the productivity of employees, and you might be able to use AI to structure their workflow in a way that they actually get into the flow state and do their best work when they need to, and sort of hit them up with things that are a little bit less interesting, but still gives them that downtime when they need to as well. Sadly, that is all the time we have for the panel, so I need to close, and it's going to be hard to summarize it. The things that for me have been the biggest takeaway, I suppose, is the first and most importantly that we can actually measure what people are doing and learn about practices in the workplace and what works best in a way that we couldn't do that before. And that's absolutely extraordinary. The second is that it's a skill. And if remote working is a skill, it's something that we can get better at. But of course, like any skill, we need the right training, and we need the right products. If it's a stationary bike to give you endurance, or if it's maybe a virtual commute, if it's to sort of give you the downtime so you can make a break between your home life at home and your work life at home. Those are just two. But I guess the most interesting thing for me is the fact that you guys are thinking about these things, because I think it's so essential. We're spending more time than ever trying to do the right thing for ourselves and our company, and the fact that you guys are sort of rethinking how we can actually improve work on a remote setting is actually really inspiring. So thank you. Jared Spataro, thank you. Shamsi Iqbal, thank you. And Gloria Mark, absolutely eye-opening. Thank you very much.